Good evening. Welcome to Economics 330, Global Trade and Political Economy, City University of New York. Today is Tuesday, September 17th, 2024. And during this week's lecture, we will continue our discussion on the major institutions for managing global trade. As such, our learning objective is that at the conclusion of this week's assessment, you will be able to successfully address the following. You will be able to explain the origins, rationales, and rules of the post-World War II institutions that were established to manage global trade. So just prior to formal part of this lecture, I had a brief conversation with one of the learners here about the United Nations, and we come to assume that the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, IMF, all these institutions have always been around. That's not quite the case. So we are going to begin to understand what some of the imperatives were that gave rise to these institutions, what they are intended to achieve. And of course, the interesting part of the class always gets to when we're at the IMF. And I look forward to how interesting those conversations will be. So pre-World War II, international organizations such as the Bank of International Settlement, or BIS, which was established in Basel, Switzerland in 1930 to oversee the settlement of German reparations after World War II. Although its main purpose was to promote cooperation among central banks, it lacked institutional capacity and mandate to successfully address major economic and geopolitical challenges, such as the Great Depression, post-World War II reconstruction of Europe, conflict resolution, and rule-making institutions. So it's important to understand that why we discuss trade is because that's the engine that drives commerce. And commerce is the means by which we create wealth. We create income and subsequently wealth. And the ability to manage trade is the ability for peoples of the world to be successful. So it's a crucial part of being able to get the global economy out of the Great Depression. Consequently, in July 1944, delegates from 44 countries convened in Bretton Woods. And within 22 days, they endorsed a framework for international economic cooperation after World War II. And this is why they call these institutions, the World Bank, IMF, they call them the Bretton Woods Institution. So this was as a result of a conference that was held in Bretton Woods somewhere in New England. And I like to say it's New Hampshire, but don't hold me to it, but I think it is. Two international economic organizations resulted from Bretton Woods Conference. First is the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, while the second is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, which is now part of the World Bank Group. In 1948, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade became the main global trade organization. The United Nations, which succeeded the League of Nations, was established after World War II, and its charter was drafted by 50 countries in San Francisco, California. And it took effect on October 24th, 1945. So you begin to see that post-World War II, institutions that govern the global order began to take shape. And these institutions are supposed to provide the architecture of what we call a rules-based international order. So when you hear somebody say that an action by a nation state goes against a rules-based international order, this is the rules that emanate from these institutions that were created post-World War II that are intended to mediate and shape and form how nation states engage with each other. So the second learning objective is to describe the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations, and the World Trade Organization. The IMF is regarded as the global lender of last resort to national governments and a leading supporter of exchange rate stability. So let's take a second to unpack that statement. So let me reiterate that statement. The IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, is regarded as the global lender of last resort to national governments and a leading supporter of exchange rate stability. And this is where IMF, fairly or unfairly, begin to get some of its challenges to its reputation. So when they say that IMF is the lender of last resort, that means that, but typically, let's actually think about how countries raise capital. Countries raise capital by charging taxes and all kinds of fees for services, right? And that's one way that they generate revenue. Another way a country can generate revenue, obviously, is by running a sound economy and having investors come and build in the country, or the country putting up bonds and having investors buy those bonds, and therefore the country is raising revenue.
Yeah.
But all these and many other ways countries raise revenue presupposes that the market has confidence in the way the country X, in this case, is being run.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens when the market loses confidence in how a country is being run?
Mm-hmm.
And the country cannot afford to pay for its exports, its imports,
Mm-hmm.
which is what they mean by exchange rate stability.
Mm-hmm.
A country has to be able to predict, to say, let me again take a step back to say that most traded commodities are, if not all, are traded and valuated in dollars, US dollars. The valuation is in US dollar. So if you are the president of country X and you want to import products to build a railroad, you're going to have to figure out what the exchange rate is from the local currency to the US dollar, which is what most of the parts, equipment, and services that you're going to need to build this railroad is going to be priced at. But you're going to charge for people to use the railroad in your local currency. So you need a little bit of predictability and stability in the exchange rate regime between your local currency and the US dollar. Otherwise, you could borrow, and it ends up that when you build that railroad, you are going to need to charge an amount of a fare. The fare would cost so much that people cannot afford to use it. If people cannot afford to use it, then you're not going to raise revenue. Then you can pay back the facility, the credit facility that you took to build a railroad.
Right.
So the technical term for this in economics is balance of trade. And when your imports exceeds your exports, it's called a balance of trade deterioration. So the question is, how are you going to get money to buy the things that you need? And this is when the IMF comes in. This is another role the IMF plays. So one role is to be the lender of last resort. But because you're borrowing from the IMF, there are things that your economy is not optimal. There are economic buffers that your economy lacks. And because IMF simply will not throw good money to bad, because if it did that, then IMF itself will go bankrupt.
It's go bankrupt, that's right.
It would have to insist on reforms. Unfortunately, those reforms can also exacerbate hardship, at least in the short run, on the people who are already in the margins in society. But yet, that's a hard pill that has to swallow. The economy almost often has to swallow to gain those facilities. But realize that the reason people always blame the IMF, and I'm not saying that the IMF is not completely not without blame. That's not the argument. But I want you to understand the entire picture. That for the country to go to the IMF in the first place, there has to be a degree of economic mismanagement. So Its stated mission of the IMF is working to foster global monetary cooperation, secure financial stability, facilitate international trade, and promote high employment and sustainable economic growth, and reduce poverty around the world. The IMF began with an original goal of reconstructing the international monetary system after World War II. Now, as I mentioned, it now plays a central role in the management of balance of payments difficulties and other financial crises. Again, balance of payment difficulties is when a country doesn't generate enough revenue, enough foreign exchange from selling stuff overseas to be able to pay for our imports. That's why you hear sometimes in impoverished countries, they don't have petrol, as an example, or they don't have enough sugar, or they don't have medication, or the price of them because of demand and supply dynamics and a depreciating local currency is so high that the average person can't afford them.
Wow.
So, as I said, the IMF began with an original goal of reconstructing the international monetary system after World War II. It now plays a central role in the management of balance of payment difficulties and international financial crisis. Through a quota system, countries contribute funds to a pool from which countries can borrow if they experience balance of payment problems. The second Bretton Woods institution is the World Bank, which, if you remember that I mentioned last week, that the World Bank is actually not one bank. Hence, the full name, the World Bank Group, is actually an institution of 5 banks, made up of 5 different institutions, financial institutions. So the World Bank is an international financial institution that provides loans, grants to governments and private institutions of low and medium income countries for the purpose of pursuing capital projects. Its vision, that is the vision of the World Bank Group, is to create a world free of poverty on a livable planet. And the second part is also important because there can be an environmental impact on development. For instance, if you wanted to build a bridge, you're going to have to dig up a bunch of concrete, a bunch of cement, and there is an environmental impact to that. If you wanted to build factories and industries to employ people and pull them out of poverty and make goods and services that people would consume and have a better quality of life, well, that industry is going to need to be powered by electricity. Quite often, the factors that power electricity can be polluting. The manufacturing process in and of itself can also have a polluting effect. So how countries develop can be as consequential as countries developing in the first place, which is why the World Bank has 2 critical focus. One is a world free of poverty, but also a world that is a livable planet, right? Because we want to be able to make sure that we don't degrade the environment and then end up having public health challenges because we're trying to get ourselves out of poverty. The World Bank Group is a unique global partnership of 5 institutions working for sustainable solutions that reduce poverty and build shared prosperity in developing countries. The other critical institution is that in 1995, the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, was superseded by the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. GATT, though largely successful in its goal, lacked a coherent institutional structure. In short, GATT is a legal agreement acting as an international organization. The World Trade Organization, on the other hand, incorporates the principles of GATT and is better positioned to carry them out because, among other things, it is better versed on issues like international intellectual property. It has faster dispute settlement mechanism and wields more power. Significantly, WTO rules also apply to services and aspects of intellectual property along with goods. The other critical institution is the United Nations, which succeeded the League of Nations and was established after World War II. And its charter, which was drafted by 50 countries in San Francisco, California, took effect on October 24, 1945. you know, World War II ended in 1945, 39 to 45. With the aim of preventing future world wars, the UN is an international intergovernmental organization whose stated purpose are to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, achieve international cooperation, and serve as a center for harmonizing the actions of nations. It is the world's largest international organization. So, a few quick things to know about the United Nations. There are two major bodies within the United Nations. One is the General Assembly, where all members of the General Assembly, all members of the United Nations, member states of the United Nations make up the General Assembly. And every year, the General Assembly elects a president. Vote in the General Assembly can add legitimacy or delegitimize actions taken by state and non-state actors. So sometimes you will hear that the UN General Assembly voted to condemn X or voted to condemn Y. Why those votes are often not non-binding. They can confer legitimacy to an action, or they can confer illegitimacy to an action, and that can carry critical consequences. It could then lead to other nation states sanctioning that government or non-governmental organization. But the highest rules-making body in the United Nations is called the United Nations Security Council. And the United Nations Security Council has 5 permanent members, and each of the 5 carry a veto power. So the 5 permanent members are the United States, Great Britain, France, Russia, China. United States, Great Britain, France, Russia, China. Of course, Germany wasn't a permanent member because when the UN was formed right after World War II, Germany in of itself was breaking up into 2 countries, West and East Germany, with East Germany becoming a satellite state of the Soviet Union, and West Germany came under governing authority of the Allied forces that liberated Germany. So Germany isn't really the Germany we know as of now. In fact, the Germany we know as of today came about, I think, in 1989 after the fall of the Soviet Union. So it is important to understand that actions by the United Nations Security Council is binding, and that it carries real consequence. So now that we've gone through these major institutions, the expectation is that at the end of this week's reading and assessment, you will be able to respond to the following questions. How does the IMF achieve its goals, right? Simple explanation is the IMF achieves its goals of fostering international financial stability by offering 3 distinct but complementary services. So this now we're getting into, first we discussed what the IMF does. Now we're getting into how the IMF fulfills its role. So from the what to the how. The IMF achieves its goal of fostering international financial stability by offering 3 distinct but complementary services. First, policy advice. To maintain stability and prevent crisis in the international monetary system, the IMF keeps a regular policy dialogue with the governments of its member countries. It assesses economic conditions and recommends policies that enable sustainable growth. The IMF also monitors regional and global economic and financial developments. Secondly, the IMF offers financial assistance. The IMF provides loans and concessional financial assistance to member countries experiencing actual or potential balance of payment problems. This is a core responsibility of the IMF. A few technical phrases that you need to be aware of. I said a couple of weeks ago that there are some phrases and words that will come up as we go through lecture that might be instructive that you write down, and that when you work them into your conversation on issues of global trade and political economy, they signal a technical understanding of the issue and a degree of subject matter expertise. The first of which is, at least with respect to the paragraph that I just covered, is concessional financial assistance. Concessional means that the loan is at below market rate. So often they can be grants, which you don't have to, countries don't have to pay back, or they can be financial facilities with very minimal interest rates. So they're called concessional lending. And again, it says countries that are experiencing actual or potential balance of payments problems. Again, I explained that balance of payment problems is when essentially for a country to pay for its imports, it has to have enough exports to have the money to pay for the imports. Sort of like for you to go out there and go grocery shopping, you have to have a paycheck coming. If the cost of the grocery that you want, grocery you're gonna go do exceeds your paycheck, now you have a balance of payment problem. If you make $80, but your grocery bill is $100, well, you're gonna come up with $20 one way or the other. How you do that becomes a challenge. This obviously is an oversimplification, but it's not that dissimilar to a balance of payment problem for a country. A country has to earn foreign exchange to pay for imports. And when it cannot earn enough to import essential commodity, then the IMF has to come in, provide some financial assistance, but on the condition, based on what they call conditionalities. That is, there are structural adjustments to the economy, to the government, to public service, to social welfare programs that the government has to agree to. Because it's sort of like if, again, bringing it back down to where it makes sense, to where we can all relate to it. There's a sort of like when the paycheck is $80, but the grocery bill is $100, and you're asking your friend to loan you $20. Well, your friend can loan you $20 if you're going out charging a big screen TV on a credit card, because that's a warning sign to your friend that you're a profligate spender and that you're quite likely not going to be able to pay them back because you're even spending money that you don't have. So part of the conditionality that your friend is going to put in to loan you that $20 might be, we're going to tear up your credit card for that. And you cannot buy any non-essential goods because you need to cut down your costs. That way you can afford to not just bring your grocery bill below your income, but also have enough savings to be able to pay me back. And that is repay your debt. And that's really essentially what, again, an oversimplification of conditionalities by the IMF. So the third function of the IMF is capacity development. This is really crucial as well. The IMF provides capacity development, which is a technical assistance and training of government officials to help member countries strengthen economic institutions and statistics, as well as capacities in the areas such as taxation and administration, expenditure management, monetary and exchange rate policy, financial system supervision and regulation, and legislative frameworks. So this just sounds like a bunch of word salad, but this are really critical roles that the public sector, i.e. government, must play fairly competently for an economy to have an opportunity to succeed. So the question then is, if the IMF plays these critical roles, why is the IMF controversial? Good question. Since the collapse of fixed exchange rates in 1973, the International Monetary Fund has taken a more active role in fostering financial stability, especially in developing countries. Some critics say the conditions the IMF attaches to its loans are too harsh and have harmed developing countries. With respect to conditionalities of credit facilities, the IMF makes the loan conditional on the implementation of certain economic policies. These policies tend to involve reducing government borrowing, higher taxes, and lower spending, which is really what I explained, albeit through an oversimplification. If you owe money, you got to generate more income. You got to reduce the amount of money you spend. So generally also, the economy, the IMF would advise the government to charge higher interest rates to stabilize the currency. And here is one way that stabilizes currency. When you charge high interest rates, the cost of money goes up. That means it will cost a lot to finance things you want to buy. On the other hand, if you put your money in an investment, in a savings account, in a mutual fund, in a CD account, as an example, you will earn higher interest rate. So in behavioral economics, this is what we call the nudge. So government will be incentivizing savings and de-incentivizing spending. And once people are saving, holding all factors constant, the currency will begin to stabilize. Another conditionality that the IMF often gives is to allow failing firms to go bankrupt. In other words, governments that are cash-strapped shouldn't be spending good money after bad. Remember, we talked about comparative advantage and absolute advantage. If a country cannot make a certain goods or service efficiently, and the companies that make these goods or service in that country are failing because they're unable to be competitive in the marketplace. One possible outcome might be to allow those companies to fail so that the economy can focus on making those things that it can make competitively, and then importing those things that it struggles to make competitively. So the other conditionality is structural adjustment, privatization, deregulation, reducing corruption and bureaucracy. And these all can be challenging. And let me just go through this very quickly. It can be challenging to say to a government that is having difficulty managing the challenges of an economy and a country to somehow add to its responsibility the privatization of some of the most prized assets in the country. Typically, this would also be the same country that you're advising to build strong institutions. Well, if you don't have strong institutions in the first place and your government's ability to manage the economy is challenged, you can see how the privatization would, at a minimum, be riddled with irregularities, if not outright corruption, and how this, in the long run, could exacerbate corruption rather than reduce corruption. So the problem is that these policies of structural adjustment and macroeconomic intervention can make difficult economic situations worse, especially in the short run. And therefore, the often heard complaints that IMF facilities worsen poverty. Another significant controversy is that the IMF does not sufficiently understand the dynamics of the countries that they work with, insisting instead on blanket reforms. Others, such as Joseph Steislinger, argue that while the IMF does while the IMF does not participate in conspiracies to further undermine indebted countries, it was reflecting the interest and ideology of Western financial community. So essentially, that while the IMF may not be in a conspiracy to undermine developing countries, but that its ideology is very Western, and that those ideologies that are very Western often can sometimes not translate well to the peculiarities of developing countries. Yet another criticism is on IMF's neoliberal policies, such as privatization. Critics argue that free market policies are not always suitable for the situation of fragile countries with weak institutions. As I have just mentioned, you're asking a country with weak institutions to manage privatization of very valuable assets. That can often be a recipe for more corruption rather than less. For example, privatization can lead to the creation of private monopolies who exploit consumers, as, as well as being criticized for implementing free market reforms. Others criticize the IMF for being too interventionist. Believers in free markets argue that it is better to let capital markets operate without attempts or intervention. They argue that attempts to influence exchange rates only make things worse, suggesting that it is better to allow currencies to reach their market level. Others further suggest that while bailing out countries with large debt creates moral hazard, because of the possibility of getting bailed out, it encourages countries to borrow more. Again, moral hazard, as I think I have previously mentioned, is one of those phrases that you must know. If you're an economic student, you must understand what moral hazard is. In a nutshell, moral hazard is that facility that is supposed to protect you from risk or from suffering a liability in the case of risk can lead to riskier behavior. Quick, simple example. If you have valuable stamps that are worth thousands, if not millions of dollars, chances are you will lock those things in a vault somewhere in a bank. However, and that would keep the stamps safe, all things being equal. But what if you bought insurance and the premium for the insurance is an amount that you think is not significant to your budget? You can see how although that insurance is supposed to help protect your asset, it could also make you create a moral hazard where you're not that eager anymore to protect your stamps, because if they get burnt, you get stolen, you're covered, you'll be fine. So that's what moral hazard is, that which is supposed to bail us out when we're in trouble can create a false sense of security where we are no longer risk averse. The IMF has also been criticized for imposing policy with little or no consultation with the affected countries. Again, the challenge with this is that you're asking IMF to consult with countries who, by and large, for either because of capacity or political constraints, are unable and or unwilling to do the necessary things to avoid putting their economy in a situation where they have to seek IMF facility. It's kind of hard for the IMF to go back to those people and have a deep consultation. Although they do, but my point is you can see how that conversation will be a little fraught. That said, the values of the IMF tend to be widely publicized, but its successes less so. Also, criticism tends to focus on short-term problems and ignores the long-term view. IMF loans have helped many countries avoid liquidity crisis. Crucially, the fact that there is a lender of last resort provides an important confidence boost for investors. This is important, especially during financial turmoil. IMF can be an easy target. Sometimes countries may need to undertake painful short-term macroeconomic adjustments, but there is a lack of political will. Again, it goes back to what I'm saying. There might be painful macroeconomic adjustments that need to be made, but there's just not the political will, because no politician wants to really raise your taxes, and no politician really wants to cut social services. So sometimes politicians and governments use IMF as an excuse. So instead of a government enacting this necessary but unpopular policy, they will go seek IMF facility and then have IMF impose those conditionalities on them for the credit facility they seek. That way they can blame the IMF rather than take responsibility. So that can also happen. So realize that countries are not obliged to take an IMF loan. If you think IMF is so bad, then don't take their credit facility. It is indeed countries who approach the IMF for a loan. That is true. IMF does not go to countries saying, hey, why don't you come get some money? Countries go to it saying, hey, we cannot need your assistance. The fact that so many take IMF loans suggests that there must be at least some benefit to the IMF loan. So again, as I said, the phrase of the week is moral hazard, the concept that individuals or institutions have disincentivized to alter their behavior when cost of their risk or bad decision making is borne by others. In closing, permit me to conclude by foreshadowing next week's lecture, which will be on the liberal perspective in international political economy. And this is where the class really begins to get exciting because there are fundamental perspectives that inform how the world is shaped. So next week, we'll begin to have those, understand the theoretical and ideological frameworks that inform global institutions and global interaction and international relations and with global commerce. So next week will be on the liberal perspective. And that's when things really begin to get fun and exciting. So I would end the recording part of this lecture, and then we can go into Q&A.